contrary to the will of Allah. And you could find girls barely into their teens who had been married back in the old country to an illiterate first cousin of theirs who, under family reunification laws, had been able to move to Europe and would eventually secure that most precious of possessions, a Western passport. But the most important thing that you could find in these communities was a widespread rejection of Western freedoms. With few exceptions, these communities were under the thumb of mullahs and imams and family patriarchs who despised European values, which, after all, not only were radically un-Quranic, but also directly threatened those men's power. They despised European women who lived their own lives, who pursued careers of their own choosing, and who dressed as they pleased. They found outrageous the idea of gay people being allowed to live their lives undisturbed. European authorities had given these people an assortment of generous benefits that went far beyond anything in human history, but they hadn't realized that the greatest thing they had to offer immigrants was freedom itself. And they hadn't realized either that while immigrants who thirsted for freedom were the best assets a free country could have, immigrants who did not want freedom and who in fact despised freedom could be a terrible deficit and even a danger to that freedom. And the unfortunate fact was that Western Europe had taken in millions of immigrants whose religion did indeed teach them to despise freedom of speech, whose religion not only frowned on freedom of religion, but punished apostasy by death, and whose religion rejected equality of the sexes in 1,000 ways, both large and small. Freedom. This was the infinitely precious thing that Western Europe had to offer immigrants, but Western Europe's own leaders, its politicians, bureaucrats, journalists, and cultural elite were blind to that fact. Indeed, freedom was the one thing that Western European authorities refrained from extending to those individuals within Muslim communities who really wanted it. On the contrary, instead of recognizing freedom as a universal value and as a precious, hard-won legacy that it was their duty to protect and preserve for future generations, the Western European establishment encouraged the development within their borders of insular, patriarchal communities that preserved as if in amber an assortment of profoundly illiberal practices, prohibitions, and power structures, all of them enforced by the most extreme and reactionary members of those communities. How could this be? What had happened? What had happened was this. Islam, a comprehensive, all-encompassing ideology which insists on its own supremacy and which impresses upon its adherents their obligation to perform acts of jihad whereby the faith may be spread to every corner of the world, Islam had met that distinctly Western phenomenon known as multiculturalism, which, rather than seeking to spread the values of the Enlightenment to everyone, encourages its adherents to respect any non-Western culture, no matter how unfree, how undemocratic, and how unenlightened. Islam had met multiculturalism, and the world would never be the same again. I should immediately point out here that when I use the word multiculturalism, I am not speaking of melting pot diversity. Multiculturalism is the opposite of the melting pot. It rejects the melting pot. Multiculturalism doesn't mean caring whether individuals with non-Western backgrounds enjoy the liberties we do. It means exalting non-Western groups, treating the rules by which they live, however oppressive, as sacrosanct, and either refusing to notice their lack of individual freedom, or pretending that there is no such thing, or, alternatively, asserting that while freedom is fine for us as Westerners, a lack of freedom is just as good for them because, well, that's their culture. It's thanks to multiculturalism that some people in the West today reflexively dismiss even the noblest aspects of the liberal tradition, but can't bring themselves to condemn even such plainly reprehensible aspects of other cultures as female genital mutilation and forced marriage. For they've been taught that it's more important to respect differences between cultures than to be concerned about the human individuals who are the victims of those differences. And it's thanks to multiculturalism that some supposedly intelligent people in the West are virtually incapable of acknowledging the nature, scale, and in many cases even the very reality of the menace that the values of Sharia, the values of the Quran, pose to a truly diverse, tolerant, and secular liberal democracy. So it was that European authorities closed their eyes to women who had lived in their countries for decades without knowing that they had a legal right not to be beaten or bullied by their fathers, husbands, mothers, and sons. They closed their eyes to the young girls born in Europe for whom the idea of being able to choose one's own spouse was and would forever remain a romantic fantasy. And in many cases, shamefully, they even closed their eyes to honor killings, the murders by parents and siblings of girls and women who, in some cases, only by doing no more than looking at a boy the wrong way, had, according to Islamic belief, soiled family honor. European authorities were so much the prisoners of multiculturalism that they could actually believe that their obligation in such matters was not to protect innocent children from brutality, but to display sensitivity to cultural difference. Within Europe's Muslim communities, only a very few unimaginably bold men and women dared to speak out against the traditional Sharia-based autocracy of the mullahs and imams. And when they did so, they were not defended, let alone praised for it by the government or media or professors, but were rather accused of betraying their people and rocking the boat. Take the writer Walid al-Qubaisi, who came to Norway from Iraq many years ago, and who has recounted a conversation he had with the ethnic Norwegian director of what al-Qubaisi described as an international cultural center. This cultural bureaucrat plainly thought of himself as being devoted, heart and soul, to the welfare of immigrants. Yet when al-Qubaisi raised the question of the freedom of Muslims to criticize or even leave their own religion, the cultural bureaucrat was displeased. "You are a Muslim, Walid," he said, "and you must not lose your identity." "But do you believe," Walid asked, that I will lose my identity if I believe in freedom of expression?" "Listen," the man replied, "this is something you decide for yourself, but your attitude causes a lot of problems. We want to create a multicultural society, and we don't want to dissolve these foreign cultures. Your attitude alters all our plans. It creates conflicts between immigrants." So it goes. While Western Europe's multicultural mentality views native Westerners as individuals who have an inalienable right to self-determination, it views Muslim immigrants as members of a group with its own collective self-definition, and while those within the group who labor to reinforce and to enforce that self-definition are rewarded, those who try to live as individuals in ways that are inconsistent with the community orthodoxy are seen as making problems, as creating conflicts. For the only legitimate identity that they have in the eyes of European multiculturalists is a collective identity, an identity yoked entirely and irrevocably to skin color, ethnicity, and religious background. If ethnic Europeans may choose to belong to any religion or none, but are expected to respect the law, Muslims, as Walid al-Qubaisi has pointed out, are seen as, quote, religious beings by nature, and therefore as people who cannot be expected to conform to European law and culture, but who cannot be blamed for adhering to even the most inhuman of Quranic precepts. It is precisely this kind of thinking, this kind of multicultural thinking, that has led judges across Europe to give perpetrators of honor killings not heavier sentences because their crimes are premeditated, but lighter sentences because their crimes in the eyes of the perpetrators' native cultures are not crimes at all. Norway's most famous lawyer has even argued that the punishment for honor killing should officially be set lower than that for other murders, his argument being that when a man has acted in accordance with his own culture's values, it is wrong, indeed arrogant, for us to consult our culture's values when determining his sentence. In short, instead of expecting the Muslim perpetrator to conform to our society's norms, we should be striving humbly and respectfully to understand his society's norms. With few exceptions, the Western European establishment's entire approach to Islam is shaped by this perverse kind of thinking. In Britain, the Queen has knighted Salman Rushdie, but she's also knighted a man who called for Salman Rushdie's death. Ken Livingstone, when he was mayor of London, not only played host to and touted the progressive credentials of Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who supports suicide bombing and the execution of gay people, but he also smeared the reputations of gay activists who criticized him for doing so. In the Netherlands, Amsterdam Mayor Job Cohen has called for, quote, accommodation with Orthodox Muslims, by which he means Orthodox Muslim men, quote, who consciously discriminate against their women, yes, their women, quote, unquote, and the acceptance of, quote, opinions and habits on the part of these Muslims, even if we do not share them or even approve of them, close quote. Cohen did not make it clear where he would draw the line, at forced marriage, at wife beating, at honor killing. I want to call special attention here to the apparent ease with which a supposed liberal, such as Cohen, is able to fall into the practice of rendering Muslim women invisible by using Muslims as a synonym for Muslim men and referring to women as if they were indeed those men's property. In recent years, Western European citizens have been hauled into court, or will soon be, for writing books, for making films, or for just saying things about Islam that were less than laudatory. There has been one ominous development after another in the West, whose significance to our freedoms many of us have failed to appreciate. The Archbishop of Canterbury has embraced the inevitability of Sharia law in the land of Magna Carta. That same country has denied a Dutch MP, Geert Wilders, entry because of things he said and written about Islam, thereby confirming Wilders' own argument about the readiness of European governments to placate Islamists by silencing their critics. A couple of years ago, the then Dutch Minister of Justice said that if 2/3 of Dutch voters wanted to introduce Sharia law in the Netherlands, he would have to accept it because, as he put it, it would be a disgrace to say this is not permitted. And leading European intellectuals have equated Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who was born in Somalia, ran away to the Netherlands from a planned forced marriage in Canada, and ended up a member of the Dutch Parliament, has equated her with the Islamic thugs who threaten her life. These intellectuals argue that if Ayaan Hirsi Ali, if her opponents are Islamic fundamentalists, then Hirsi Ali, because she stands up unequivocally and uncompromisingly for liberty, is an Enlightenment fundamentalist, as they put it. In their view, what's desirable is to be what they consider moderate, flexible, accommodating. In other words, to be willing to sacrifice freedom on the altar of multicultural harmony. And to make this sacrifice, we're repeatedly told, is only reasonable.